Let's start that. Okay. All right. Oh boy, it worked. Oh boy. Okay. So obviously, like the thesis that I completed this semester was Pregnancy Discrimination in Higher Education, a Structural Approach. And I'm going to start by explaining exactly what I did and kind of my main points and go through some of the theoretical background that really framed this study. So essentially, my main argument with this entire project is that pregnant students at public and private universities are systematically disenfranchised by university systems, not through individual interactions of discrimination that involve prejudice, but more through the common structure of the universities themselves. So especially at schools as large as like Florida State, University of Florida, the university offers as operates as kind of like a mini society in and of itself. It has its own campus culture, its own infrastructure, its own policies. So in addition to the complicated world of pregnancy discrimination in overall society and how we view natalism and fertility and the varying values we place on that, there's also this specific society within the university that the pregnant student has to function in. So first, the most fun I have with this project is that I interviewed a student who became pregnant during her time at Florida State and subsequently dropped out because of the various structural barriers that she encountered, and then transferred to another school in which there was a lot of resources and support specifically for her situation. And that's going to help us visualize what I'm talking about when I say structural pregnancy discrimination, because a lot of people, they were not like mean to her. No one was kicking her out of class or explicitly telling her to drop out, but the systems at our university made it so difficult for her to succeed that she ended up leaving her degree here to pursue it somewhere else. And then I do some legal analysis. I'll try not to spend too much time on that, but it's hard to talk about pregnancy discrimination in an educational context without talking a little bit about Title IX and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then that'll bleed right into some of the theory analysis. Specifically, of course, this fits into feminist theory, but it also fits into disability theory and whether or not pregnancy should be considered a disability, and we'll kind of explore what constitutes disability itself and how discrimination in education can also be a contributing factor to a really big idea in the school of thought regarding gender and work, which is the motherhood penalty. We talk a lot about how pregnancy and motherhood impact women's careers, and I think we want to expand that approach a little bit to also constitute educational disruption and the long-term effects that that can have. And then this was the original research I did there, the study I conducted. So basically, I wanted to look at universities across the country and see what they have to offer. I wanted to see if these things that I think universities should be doing to serve pregnant students were ridiculous demands or if they were already in place elsewhere. And basically, I kind of invented my own little system to rank them. When I get to data and results, I'll talk about this a little more in detail. But basically, I established these 6 criteria that I consider if the answer is yes to these questions, then that is a good thing that the university has to support pregnant students. And so I took 102 schools, 50 from each state and DC, 1 public and 1 private for each state. And in each of these 6 categories for each of those schools, I ranked them either -1, 0, or 1, and then added up the totals at the end. And I'll explain this a little more clearly when I get to data and results. I'm like a visual person, so I've got all my charts and stuff in here that I think will make that a little easier to understand. Yeah, I'll explain this when we get to the rankings, and I'll tell you how I came up with the criteria and how I kind of justify the way I scored these. And then I also am going to separate the data into like private versus public schools, religious versus secular, because I was trying to see if there were any common factors between the schools that performed really well and the schools that did not so great. Okay, so first,
can I butt in for a second and ask you a question about your sample, since we're talking about it? I'm the sociologist on the committee. So I just was curious, how did you, first of all, that was a really large sample, 102 universities. I thought that was really ambitious, and I was really impressed that you were able to look at so many. How did you choose the 2? Did you have like a sampling frame? Did you kind of randomly select a public and a private university, or did you just, was it ones you knew about? Or I'm just curious.
I took the top 4 from each state, and then I randomly chose 1 public and 1 private out of those 4.
Gotcha. So top four, like ranking US News and World Report kind of ranking. Is that what you're?
Yes.
Okay,
Mhm.
great.
So that way I
That's
got like, I wanted like the highest population schools as well, just because the impact on students would be broader. But yeah, that's
so
what I
if
went with.
that's not in your write-up, whatever you do with the project
Mhm.
afterwards, definitely add that because that's an
Okay.
important detail, I think, for people to understand just how rigorous your methods were. So nice job.
Awesome.
Okay,
Okay. Thank you so
you can
much.
keep going. I just had to ask.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So first I want to start off with the interview that I did because this really helped inform the project as a whole, and it helped me visualize kind of exactly what I wanted to talk about when we're talking about like systemic pregnancy discrimination and not just these individual encounters. So Aubrey, I'm redacting her last name from the study for her privacy and because she transferred to another school where she's doing very well. And I wanted her to feel comfortable speaking with me. So we're just going to refer to her as Aubrey. So these are some of the institutional barriers that hindered her success specifically. So one of the first major obstacles for her was healthcare. Our university health center does not accept Medicaid, which Aubrey is on, and the University Women's Clinic was unable to direct her to outside care or community resources. So Aubrey was pregnant at Florida State, and she went to the health center to try and find prenatal care, but they did not accept Medicaid, and she could also not use her specific Medicaid plan outside of her home county. So she was unable to get health services there. But when she asked where she could go, staff was just a little bit unprepared. They didn't really have any answers for her questions. She felt a little bit judged, a little bit pressured for keeping the child and staying in school, because at this point she had definitely made up her mind to go through with the pregnancy and was just looking for prenatal care, but she didn't really find any answers. And then transportation was a very huge issue for Aubrey. She lived on campus, but the buses were very frequently, they were late and unreliable. During her summer term, they would stop running after 5 p.m. So this led to her walking miles a day across campus in really high temperatures. And this actually led to a lack of weight gain during her pregnancy and several complications. So she became a high risk pregnancy due to the excess physical activity that she was doing to get to and from class. And then eventually she found that our Office of Accessibility Services has transportation assistance that could apply to pregnant students, but because on their website and in the resources that we provide, it just talks about students with injuries or students with pre-existing conditions that limit mobility, she didn't know that it could apply to her. And when she went to different departments around the school asking, is there anything that can help me out? I'm like walking miles a day. People mostly just referred her to the bus system. Again, we also do not have family housing at Florida State University. She was trying to plan for the future for when her child arrived, how she would continue her degree here. I believe the year was 2015. We used to have a few family housing units, but we did demolish them. So that was also unavailable. Then childcare was a huge issue. So we do have a daycare at FSU that students, faculty, staff, and outside community members can utilize. So a month into her pregnancy, so 8 months in advance of her child's birth, she tried to secure a place in the daycare. She was placed on a wait list and she could not get in. She would check in all the time. And it was not actually until after this interview was completed and her son is now a year old, that she got a call from the FSU daycare a year after dropping out, to offer her a space that had opened up. So availability and access is one issue, and then cost is the second. So there is a discounted rate if you're an FSU student or faculty member for the daycare, and that's $800 a month for infant care. Of course, any daycare for infants is going to be very expensive, but the average in the state of Florida is $725 a month for reference. So this is still pretty expensive, and the discount did not quite make the biggest difference. She also utilized the University Counseling Center, and this was another instance where nobody was trying to explicitly discourage her, but they seemed very unprepared and insensitive to her situation. So when she went to talk to someone, she felt that they were kind of in over their head. They didn't really know how to help her. She again felt that they were very insensitive and judgmental of her choice for keeping the child and pursuing her degree. And they were also, let's see, the little video bar is in my way a bit. And they were again unable to direct her to outside resources when she asked, where can I go to get help? Because she went a very, very long time with no prenatal care, which also contributed to the high risk pregnancy in the long term. Another thing, this was before the onset of the coronavirus, so all of her degree areas and even like several backup plans, none of them were available fully online or remotely. So that was also a challenge for Aubrey once the pregnancy became high risk, is that she could not take online classes instead to limit her mobility. And these are some significant quotes from the interview. I'll try not to just like read at you, but these are some that stuck out to me. So she left the women's clinic feeling more hopeless and wondering how I could ever advocate for my son if people wouldn't let me advocate for myself. And then about transportation, she said the bus system at FSU was something else during the summer. They would stop it at 5. They were never on time, so it wasn't reliable. I had to walk so much during the summer. It was exhausting in the heat up and down the hills that make up the FSU campus. I even remember when I finally found my prenatal doctor, they yelled at me a lot because of how little weight I had gained in the first 4 months of pregnancy, and they were very concerned. So she was at the 4-month mark before she ever got in to see a prenatal care physician. Oh my goodness, Zoom. And then lastly, this was kind of about the overall culture that she felt trying to find help on campus. The university didn't know what to think of me as a pregnant student with no support. Over the summer, I was going to every single department I could think of to get resources and ask for help. The university apparently got tons of emails from these departments, and their solution was, oh, the girl seems overwhelmed, let's send her home. Luckily, my case manager was there to explain to FSU that I had no home to go to. So from Aubrey's experience, we can see that pregnancy discrimination is not just this interpersonal interaction, but it was systemic. It was built into the resources that we have on campus. So by not training faculty and staff in all these various departments to be aware, sensitive, or even proactive regarding pregnant students and student parents, it unwittingly kind of creates this hostile at worst to difficult at best environment for students like Aubrey. So it wasn't that none of these people wanted to help her. Like for instance, the people at the counseling center, the people at the women's clinic, they wanted to help her, but they did not have answers for her questions. And then because of issues like us not accepting Medicaid, they couldn't offer her the care that she needed either. And then these were some of the positives. I didn't want to just roast Florida State for the entire study, but she did have really positive things to say about case management. They frequently advocated for her. She did not feel judged. She felt they were very sensitive for her situation. Financial aid was also very eager to help her. They were very sensitive to the situation and they helped her as best they could. And then eventually, when she found the services that she was able to utilize, the OAS did give her transportation assistance to get to and from class. She was already pretty far into the pregnancy at that point, but still, once she did find that resource, it was very useful. And then what she ended up doing is she dropped out of Florida State and she transferred to University of Florida, which she described as night and day. So several of her degree areas were available fully online. There was a campus food pantry like we have here, but theirs included diapers and baby formula, other essential supplies for newborn care. They had 6 different family housing locations. She would hardly have to pay anything for daycare as a student, and all the daycares were connected to the family housing by bus route that ran throughout the daycare's entire hours. They also have a university hospital. We do not have a teaching hospital here, which obviously not every university can offer, but she was able to get classes on childcare, on giving birth, on breastfeeding, on newborn care right on campus for little to no cost. Her kid is even eligible for free swimming lessons in her family housing unit, and the campus bathrooms around were well equipped with changing tables and lactation rooms. So she thought it was just complete night and day, and since transferring there, she's really been thriving. She did let me include this picture. So this is her son, who I won't be naming, but she's now a student at the University of Florida. He was born happy and healthy despite all of the complications, and he just celebrated his first birthday a few months ago. So it all went very well for her as soon as she transferred to an institution that was willing to support her, but also had infrastructure in place that would allow her to succeed. And then I'm gonna try and not spend too much time on this because I can chatter for a while, as y'all know who've had me in class. But I want to talk about Title IX and the ADA because that applies a lot to how the university sees pregnancy and what their obligations are. So Title IX is very vague when it comes to pregnancy. Basically, it dictates that you can't expel a student, you can't force her out of your class or out of school for being pregnant, but it does not have any specifications for how you have to accommodate that student. So if you're a pregnant student, you are entitled to be reinstated and you are entitled to a leave of absence, but it does not define these terms. It does not define what you're entitled to in terms of makeup work or what reinstatement means, if that means you can, if you're ordered on bed rest, if you can come back to class after, or if you're just expected to take the class again next semester. Some universities would describe that as reinstatement. It doesn't say how long your leave of absence can be, and it doesn't provide the university any guidelines as to how to provide these things that they're legally obligated to provide. So the Department of Education has tried to clarify these protections, and they've added all kinds of regulations, but they still do not define these things that pregnant students are entitled to. And so the majority of pregnant students who file for discrimination ultimately lose, because essentially they have to prove that they were discriminated against based on their pregnant status and nothing else, and that they did not get the rights that they were entitled to. But because these are so vague, reinstatement and leave of absence, universities and professors can say, well, I gave her the day off for this doctor's appointment, so she got a leave of absence, or she was allowed to come back to class right after she had the baby, so she was reinstated. So like I said, these common scenarios, it's not allowing students to make up work, even if it was for a pregnancy related medical issue. And often the universities win these discrimination cases as long as they just didn't basically say, you're pregnant, you're not allowed to come to class. So I chose two cases to kind of use as a case study for these issues. This was an example of a case that was like not so tight. So the student was placed on doctor ordered bed rest, but she was a nursing major. So she had a twice a week clinical requirement for her degree, but she was not able to complete it because of the mandatory bed rest. They offered an incomplete grade. They told her that she should retake the class in a different semester, but she wasn't okay with this because it delayed her graduation. This is where some of the ADA arguments came in. She argued that since she was pregnant, that she was protected under Americans with Disabilities and therefore was being discriminated against. But because the university offered a few different like creative opportunities of their own creation on how she could make up work or how she could possibly fulfill this requirement, and she didn't take any of them, she ultimately lost the case. She got an F, it lowered her GPA and delayed her graduation. And also this was interesting, the court's decision in this case, as many of these cases have been, was still inconclusive as whether or not the ADA applied to her specifically. They basically said, we're not so sure, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And then this was a very rare, like airtight case that a student won very easily. So the student was named Stephanie Hogan, and she was in a video production class. The class had mandatory attendance, and there was no late work, no makeup work accepted. And so at the 8-month point in her pregnancy, she had not missed a single class. She had turned in every assignment, but she had to miss one class for a doctor's appointment due to some complications. And she was told it would be excused, but then she was placed on emergency bed rest. This caused her to miss a test that was a prerequisite for another assignment that weighed 55% of the grade. So it quickly snowballed into something that could seriously impact her. But when she went to the professor, she gave several solutions, offering to take the test from home, asking for any of the makeup work or a partial grade. She was refused. The professor recommended that she withdraw from the course entirely. And the only reason that she won the case was not because of any of that. It was because other students were allowed to make up the assignment that were not her. So she was able in court to say, the only difference between me and those students who were allowed to make up their work is that I am pregnant and they are not. And that's how she won the case. And without that, she would have likely lost. So we can see in these cases, it's often a matter of luck and circumstance whether or not they win in the end, because obviously this professor is making it very difficult for a clearly dedicated student to succeed. But if he had not committed that act of like very blatant, obvious discrimination, she likely would have lost this case. So what I want to point out about this is that it's not just about university bad, student good, but these laws put the universities at a disadvantage as well. And they also put instructors at a disadvantage. Because they don't give guidelines on how instructors in universities are supposed to provide these things for students, they kind of have to reinvent the wheel on like a case by case basis. And so what one student works out with their professor may be a really good plan to complete their work, while another person may be really struggling. There's no infrastructure in place, there's no standards. So not only do pregnant students suffer because it's really hard to work out these situations, but instructors who might mean their best can end up getting like sued for discrimination. And it's not always their fault because they may have just not known what was expected of them, and there aren't any guidelines to tell them how to do so. Most of the time what happens is that pregnant students try to just tough it out, but that only hurts them in the end because then they perform poorly due to all of the obstacles. And then that is used in court to say that regardless of their pregnancy, they were not performing well in class. And that is how they got the poor grade that they did. This is kind of what I just talked about. This is another important thing to note with the ADA is that it does not recognize pregnancy as a disability, but it does recognize several associated conditions and symptoms of pregnancy as disabilities. So like things like morning sickness, severe anemia, high blood pressure, swelling, mood swings, these things count as disabilities under the ADA, but exactly like Title IX, the ADA does not tell you specifically what accommodations you're entitled to. So for instance, in the case of like employment, maybe you can't lift over 20 pounds, but your employer still has you working day to day, constantly lifting things that are 15 pounds. So they'll say in court that they accommodated you because you didn't have to lift anything over 20 pounds, but that doesn't mean that the work was much less grueling or had a positive effect on the pregnancy in any way. So because they're just left to their own devices to invent their own accommodation systems, it's just frankly a mess, and it opens up instructors and employers to litigation, and it disadvantages pregnant people as well. So pregnancy is disability. I just want to talk about this briefly because it informed some of the points that I make in the data. So I call this like parallels of positionality, like just people with a disability and people who are pregnant are in very similar situations in society in a lot of different ways, just culturally and how we perceive them. So some disabled people are kind of revered and used as inspiration, whether or not they really want to, and others are kind of pitied or more looked down on, again, regardless of whether they want that response or not. So with pregnancy, we can picture like kind of like the white middle class married woman, her first child is on the way. By default, that's like a congratulatory event. She's revered, she's glowing. But a pregnant teenager alternatively is going to be judged and or pitied. She'll be seen as a tragic or irresponsible situation. She will be judged based on her sexual choices, even though said pregnancy, especially at that age, may not have been her choice at all. And then similarly, the disabled person is often either like placed on a pedestal or outcast dependent on different things. So someone who is permanently wheelchair bound may face like condescending pity or praise as they're used for other people's inspiration. But those who are more in and out of temporary mobility assistance, people will argue about whether or not they're really disabled, or they'll again be wrongfully idolized as somebody who like, oh, they learned to walk again. We call this like inspiration porn. And again, it's just about how society views the body. It's about body politics. We also see those with invisible illnesses like fibromyalgia are dismissed entirely. So these can be very similar conditions in terms of their impairment and in terms of how other people pass judgment on them. And then this also applies to like government regulation of the body, which relates again to some of the pregnancy discrimination laws we discussed. So just like the law dictates what a woman can and cannot do, obviously in regards to pregnancy, a lot of the time, such as like abortion laws and requiring a husband's permission to get your tubes tied. People with disabilities also face a lot of these regulations about their body and the freedoms that they have to do things with their body. So for example, most people with disabilities who live off of welfare and government assistance, if you get married, they can take away both Medicaid and supplementary income. So these are both groups of people that face regulation that has to do with their body and with like societal perceptions of their body's condition. So I thought that was kind of an important theoretical lens to take as I moved on. And then one last point I thought was really interesting is that from a legal perspective, pregnancy is often viewed as an injury. So in cases of sexual assault, a pregnancy will be evaluated as any physical injury would be. I included this quote from a law journal about pregnancy. So if a woman is sexually assaulted and she becomes pregnant, they're going to treat it as if she had severe head trauma, as if she was shot with a gun. So we do have infrastructure in place in the legal system that already looks at pregnancy as like a debilitating condition that entitles you to certain things. And then this is a really beneficial theory or lens for informing how to move forward, because if universities recognize pregnancy as a disability, they can easily incorporate all of the resources that they already have for students with disabilities and just expand them to apply to pregnant students too. So that's kind of what I said here. And that is efficient, it's practical. Like, for example, in Aubrey's situation, if the Office of Accessibility Services had a page that directed her to resources that would apply to pregnant students and not just to students with injuries or students who are wheelchair bound, she would have found that resource a lot easier, and she would have found it earlier as well. Also, because we have so many systems in place for exactly how to accommodate students with disabilities, if you allow those to apply to pregnancy as well, then you have standards, you have guidelines, and you have a system in which this case will be managed. And it's not just on this individual basis of students trying to make deals with every professor, every department, working out different systems for makeup work. There will actually be requirements and guidelines. And then the motherhood penalty, I don't have a bunch of slides about this. I just wanted to mention it because this is a really big theory in gender and work and gender and family, is that women, when they become mothers, they lose time in the workplace. Employers are hesitant to hire women more often because they assume that they will become pregnant and leave the position or take a leave of absence. And I think that that lens can really be applied to educational disruption as well, because you are losing time on your degree, you are losing time that other students are able to spend studying full time. That limits your opportunity for scholarships and awards and other like extracurricular pursuits that can help your career, help you go on to grad school, things like that. So when we're talking about the long-term effects of pregnancy discrimination in education, I think that also applies to this long-term effect on the trajectory of their careers. Okay, now here's the study I did. Sorry, I talked a lot. I hope I'm not going on too long. I can be a little nerdy about all this. So first I wanted to help you guys visualize, we won't be reading all this, but how I went about this. So this was the system I created, state by state, alphabetical order, one public school, one private school, randomly selected from those top four. And then this was each of the 6 requirements that I had for a university that is very accommodating of pregnant students. And then I wrote the answer specifically for each of these. So for instance, does the University of Alabama have prenatal care in their health center? Yes. Do they take Medicaid? Yes. And I answered all of these questions. And then I went through this sheet, and for everything where the answer was yes, I made it green. If it was no, I made it red. And if it was kind of like a neutral, like they kind of have this, they kind of don't, I made it yellow, to make it easier for me visually. And then I converted that all into the numerical scores. So for instance, like I said, the University of Alabama, they have prenatal care and obstetrics at their University Health Center. That's an easy answer. It's a yes. So they get 1 point here. All of the things in the second category where you see they got a -1, this criteria was, does their health center accept Medicaid? So every school where the answer was no, they got a -1. And a few exceptions I made is for universities in smaller states, especially with lower populations, did not have health centers at all. They were more incorporated into the broader community. So to kind of like, I didn't want to necessarily dock them unfairly, because a lot of the ways they integrated into the community were good ways of providing healthcare. So I marked those in pink just to remind myself what those answers were, and I gave them a neutral 0. And then at the end, Zoom keeps blocking me, I put all the total scores here so I could see how each school did. And let me show you. Ooh, come on, Google Chrome.
Can I ask a question while you're pulling that
Yeah,
stuff
of course.
up? So how did you find the information about each university? Was it just based on their website and you were able to glean all that and answer your questions, or did you have to end up like calling people, or was it
It
just
was
like, if I
both.
can't find it on their website, it doesn't exist, so it doesn't count, like it's not accessible, or?
Yeah, this was, sorry, I'm just trying to pull this up. Give
Okay.
me one moment, because Zoom. Yeah, so most of it I was able to find through the university website. Other times I did have to make phone calls, but my rule for judging things that got like the -1 is, if it's taking me like half an hour to answer this one basic question, then it's not accessible. So for
Right. Okay.
instance, with Aubrey's case, we had this resource that was really helpful for her, but she was calling every department, she was working with case management, working with the Title IX office, doing all these things, and she didn't find it until she was 5 months into a high-risk pregnancy.
Yeah.
So if it was taking a enormous amount of effort for me to find basic information, then I basically said -1, because odds are that a student will struggle to find it. And
Right.
I'm trying to show you my
Great.
rankings if Zoom will let me share my browser. There it is. So all those numerical scores I then put into this massive chart and I ranked them from highest to lowest. And then I observed a lot of the different trends, which are super, super interesting. I can't wait to talk about those. So as we can see, like universities that scored 6 were like very few in number, but they did exist. Some 5s, some 4s, but most of the scores were roughly in the middle. So because there are 6 categories and you could either lose a point, gain a point, or get nothing, this put them on a scale from -6 for the worst performing schools and 6 for the best performing schools. So when I put them onto a normal curve, which I was so proud about, let me see if I can go back here. There we go. So the first thing I did once I had those rankings is I looked at their distribution. Zoom, let me see my full chart. I also just want to note that this is definitely my biggest weak point in research methods thus far in my undergrad career. Statistics, statistical analysis, which are so important for what I want to do. Definitely the most difficult for me. But I was proud of how this came out. So basically, it showed that the distribution was fairly normal, which is like super important because it shows that the criteria I used was not like completely outlandish. Like there were some schools that do meet all this criteria, even though they were few in number, and schools for the most part did not have like 0 of these things. There were only a few schools that scored like -6. Most of them were in the middle. So most of them had a mix of some of these resources. The next thing I wanted to look at was I wanted to see if religious affiliation had an effect on how accommodating universities were of pregnancy, essentially because of the way that we view pregnancy culturally and the way that more religious schools may view things like abortion. I wanted to see if they would be actually like more accommodating of students who are pregnant because, you know, a young person who is keeping their baby, but we found that the average was slightly lower, not insanely for religiously affiliated universities, but you can see overall our average was -0.3. And when we go to just the religiously affiliated university scores, it dropped to 0.9. The deviation was also a little lower. They were a little closer together. And then this is just the secular schools. And you can see that the average was higher. So non-religiously affiliated schools did about like a point better on the scale from -6 to 6 on average. So again, not a huge difference, but they did perform a little more poorly, which I thought was interesting. I thought maybe these are like my hypothetical implications. It could have to do with campus culture and how welcome pregnant students feel. It could be about religious universities not wanting to offer certain resources because they don't want to like encourage young pregnancy, things like that. And then of course, a lot of these religious universities were more in like the South, which is typically a more conservative area geographically in the mainland US. So that could be a factor. That's one of my areas for like further research is I kind of want to know why there is that disparity, but it's not a huge disparity either. So that's not like a major conclusive finding. The next thing I wanted to look at was private versus public universities, mostly because public universities are more like they're more regulated, they're more subject to different laws when it comes to their funding, where private schools have a little more freedom to kind of do as they please. And again, we can see the average for private universities was about -1, but the average for public universities was about 0.3. So again, not this huge difference, but public universities did do better than the private ones by a little bit. So I thought that was interesting. It was statistically significant enough to mention, but I did not consider it significant enough to like be conclusive that like if a university is religious, it's harder to be a pregnant student. Again, even though 102 universities is like a large sample, at least in regards to me as an individual doing this research, there are so many universities in the US, I would actually like prefer the sample to be like doubled and see if that disparity remained at all.
It would
And
have been
then,
interesting to have the
yes,
median as well. I'm just saying as another indication here of the distribution, in addition to the average, just to see if those differences stay the same. I'm just highlighting.
yeah, yeah, there's all kinds of things I could do with this data. I had to like stop myself because I was like, I could make like 20 different normal curves with like 20 different factors.
Mm.
And then I included this in the appendix since it's very like lengthy and complicated. But here's like all the numerical scores ranked. so that we can see also on average how each school did in each category, how people did overall in this category. Let me jump back up to data and results, or I'm trying to find where I put some percentages, but like some major findings I found is that like most schools did not accept Medicaid, although some schools did. And that is a really, really important thing, because a lot of these schools measured, oh, actually, sorry about this. A lot of the schools measured, or I measured a lot of the schools based on what healthcare services they offered, but it doesn't matter if they offer a ton of different services for pregnant students if students cannot afford to access those. So before I like move on, like kind of wrap up, I wanted to just go over the criteria I used because I think I kind of skimmed over that in the beginning. So first I looked if there was a health center that offered both prenatal and obstetric services. Most schools I found were like scored like that 0 in the yellow. They had pregnancy testing, they had basic gynecological care, but they didn't really have anything past that. Some of them had pregnancy counseling to help you be directed towards outside resources. That was one of the things we were missing at FSU. But overall, it was really only like major well-funded universities that had these things. Then I looked at whether or not they accepted Medicaid. And then I looked at what are the resources for students who cannot afford medical care, because some of these schools didn't accept Medicaid, but they had their own system that made their healthcare accessible, like tuition covered all health services if you visit the on-campus center, or the student insurance was affordable at a rate that was very comparable to Medicaid and stuff like that. So even though the school didn't offer Medicaid, they had great resources in place. Then I looked at, does the university have defined and accessible academic accommodations? So the way I went about answering this question was mostly through the school's disability center, accessibility service office, and I looked if they included pregnant students explicitly in their outlines for academic accommodations. Many did, most did not, but what most did do was they had kind of this open to interpretation approach where they would have a temporary impairments category, and on a case-by-case basis, students could go to the center with their temporary impairment, a note that documents that impairment, and work out a plan for accommodation. Um, and then I looked at physical accommodations because you may have a great plan worked out for makeup work and when you have doctor's appointments, time off when you give birth, but you don't have rides to class and stuff like that. So with physical accommodations, I looked mostly at transportation assistance, but I also looked at the things like accessible seating, because a heavily pregnant person does not fit comfortably into the typical lecture hall seat, lactation rooms, changing tables in bathrooms, stuff like that, that makes just the university more acceptable for someone with a young child. And then I looked at if they had case management services, because the law is so vague. This was a really essential one right here, whether or not they had a person specifically working with them to navigate all of this, because it's incredibly complicated. There's no standardization. So about, I'd say like 1/3, little higher, had like solid case management services. Mostly this would be done through the accessibility center if they were open to receiving pregnant students, or it was done through a Title IX office, which not all schools even had, the majority did. Um, but again, there was all kinds of, there was a really diverse response to this, because again, every school has to like literally reinvent the wheel when it comes to accommodating pregnant students, because there's no standardization. These are the findings that I already kind of went through, who did better, who did worse. And then these were my solutions that I gleaned kind of from the evidence I gathered in this research. So one thing is that universities in general should just familiarize themselves with the rights of pregnant and parenting students and make this information accessible. So one thing is that students don't know their rights and instructors don't know what's expected of them. So some of the schools I researched, they had a web page that was just for pregnant students. It came up like first thing in the Google search, I typed in university name plus pregnancy, and they were like, boom, campus pregnancy resource center or pregnancy case management, Title IX, what you're entitled to, things like that. So ways that universities can do this is by having a Title IX office or a similar case management system. And then even though the law does not, the university should have a standard policy for these cases that defines leave of absence and reinstatement in terms regarding makeup work, so that there is kind of across the board guidelines for instructors to follow. in cases with these students so that they can work with them and also know what's expected of them. On a broader scale, of course, we need more legislation to expand on the rights of pregnant students and to just better define what they're entitled to, because technically they have these rights, but they don't really receive them. And healthcare accessibility is a huge one. University health centers are able to accept Medicaid. They have to apply to be eligible to accept Medicaid, but it is possible. And if not, they should have financial assistance resources available for students, especially because there are also students who do not qualify for Medicaid, but still can't afford care. Healthcare is a mess in this country. And the more accessibility there is on campus, that is of huge benefits to students. And for schools with teaching hospitals and these more expansive health centers, offering prenatal and obstetric services is usually not considered a priority because they're primarily serving young people. But this is a misconception because there are a lot of young faculty and staff members, young students, grad students with children, and just even undergrads who are pregnant. People get pregnant at lots of ages. Physical campus resources are really important. Changing tables, I have something specific about FSU to share about that, lactation rooms, and a food pantry that carries these things. Again, this is something that because of the population that they are serving, they tend to think that these are not needed, but they are, and it makes a huge difference when food pantries can carry baby foods, diapers, and other necessities. Quality transportation, I think we've talked enough about what makes that realistic, and a supportive campus culture, which is of course like the vaguest, but cultural change of course takes forever. But the goal should be a mindset that the university wants to help the pregnant student succeed and not immediately assume that they cannot complete their degree while balancing this pregnancy. Because in Aubrey's story, we saw like she really wanted to finish her degree. She was a straight A student. She was a STEM major. She was very dedicated. But the response that she got was just kind of like, why are you even still here? Go have the baby and then maybe come back. And she was like, no, I want to do my work and stuff like that. So again, like the default mindset should be, how can this student succeed here? And not immediately seeing them as like kind of like a burden or somebody who is not going to be able to pull through, because most of them do try to tough it out and they end up failing because of a lot of these structural barriers. And then my impact and contributions. I feel like I've been talking for an hour. I'm so sorry. But basically the biggest idea that I wanted to provide evidence for is that we usually think of pregnancy discrimination as individual or interpersonal. So I hope that this showed how it can be a more structural and systemic problem in higher education. We also usually talk about discrimination regarding pregnancy, like exclusively in terms of employment. We rarely talk about it in terms of education specifically. I thought the literature when I was doing the research for this was really lacking in that department. And then this was kind of my first experiment with something I want to do in the long term with like this ranking system and stuff. Is I'm really, really interested in creating systems that help us like quantify like social phenomena so that we have more ways of like comparing and contrasting data and identifying trends, because we know in like the social sciences, that's like the hardest part. So I really like doing that. This was kind of my first shot at it, inspired by things like the Global Sexism Index and things like that. So I had a lot of fun doing it, and I think it was a useful tool. So I think that was a success. And of course, like there's great need for further legislation that this provided evidence for. And I'm hoping that the solutions section can also serve universities and like providing ideas and resources. So for example, over the duration of this project, I used some of the data that I gathered to start. Dr. Richardson and Dr. Homan will remember me plastering flyers all over campus for this. But I started the FSU Changing Table Initiative with my roommate, my friend Hannah Yende, and we recently passed that through FSU SGA to get $12,000 for more changing tables in first floor men's and women's rooms across campus. And I was able to do that because of the research I was doing on this project and because of the experiences that Aubrey shared with me, and just listening to the grievances of student parents in general. So already I was able to accomplish something with this, and that was really rad. And that's my little presentation. I feel like I talked for very long. I am sorry, but
Yeah, that was great.
Well done.
thanks.
Thank you. Are there questions?
Do you want to? I'm totally outside of my comfort zone. If it's not clear, I'll make it clear from the get-go. I'm not a sociologist. I don't deal with, I don't know why she chose me to sit here, but I enjoy having Emily in my class, and therefore I couldn't say no. So my starting point was, what's the meaning of discrimination? Do we need to prove intent, right? Um, and it seems like there's not necessarily an intent to discriminate, but I love how you called it structural barriers that kind of disable, put certain individuals in a disadvantage point. And I think it would have been beneficial to include a definition for what is discrimination, because I looked into it and actually it doesn't necessarily involve intent, right? As long as the outcome leads to to some kind of a bias or some form of discrimination, that's what it is. So including some kind of a definition like you did with the pregnancy, I think would have been useful. And again, I see these comments as just things that popped up to me and someone that look at it from the outside, right? So forgive me if I'm coming up with things that are. The other thing that kind of, very obvious to me from the get-go is that there are two stories here. There's the story of pregnancy and there's the story of parenthood, right? And in some places, those come together in your paper. And I think more focus on strictly pregnancy, because once they are born, it's a whole loop of other issues. And then it's not just women, right? Because that we should think about it as parenthood of two people that are supposedly require some kind of needs or accommodations because they are young or because they are parents, right? During and within the education system. So I think doing separation there and being very clear that you're only dealing with pregnancy, I think that would have been beneficial. I think the project that you have done and the fact that you have real meaningful recommendations for institutions, this is incredible. This is, for me, a very unique contribution. I don't think I've seen a thesis as a committee member or as a supervisor that offered real tangible solutions to, and practical, right? My middle name is pragmatic. So I want pragmatic solutions to problems like that. And here we go, all you got to do is talk to the, find people in the university to talk to them and say, I have a pragmatic solution to this problem. It's not that difficult too, because some of these services we already have in place. You just need to broaden them to students who are pregnant. This discussion with disability and pregnancy, that made me think, right, of to what extent I agree with you there. And it's tough. In my mind, it's a temporary impairment, right? That, by the way, the majority of women do not deal with issues during that time, and we have those minorities that do, and they need to be accommodated in some way. And I understand the utility of it for the broader framework, but I still, I as a former pregnancy with twins, I have an issue with considering this as disability. I do understand that it's for legal purposes, but these are my main comments, and I see them as comments. Anything that you and Leslie decide to do is as the final product. I'm very proud of the product that you've produced. I'm celebrating you and congratulating you for this amazing work.
Thank you. No, you actually brought up so many things that I was wondering about that I wanted feedback on. One thing for the disability section is I'm with you, because I don't think that I myself even have a conclusive opinion on whether or not pregnancy is a disability. In the context of this work, I think that legally it should be considered one. And universities should consider one, just so they can incorporate it into these existing systems for accommodation. But it's such a complicated theoretical debate, especially with what you brought up is some, when it comes to body politics, the idea of what isn't and is a disability, some people can find empowering or disempowering depending on their situation. So some pregnant women might be like, I don't have a disability, like I'm rocking it. While others might be like, I'm really struggling here. This is really impairing my life. So that was really interesting. And also that was very helpful. I'm so glad, because I brought you here to be my outside member, because obviously Dr. Homan and Dr. Richardson, gender and work and all these things are like their whole jam. So I wanted to make sure it made sense to someone where this isn't like their whole thing. And I'm really glad I did that. I definitely thought a lot of, I struggled with the parenthood versus pregnancy thing while making this. Like things like lactation rooms and changing tables. Those are more where it's like, that's more of a young parent thing than a pregnancy thing. So the way I was kind of justifying it is like having those resources around can kind of like aid the campus culture of being like supportive of young parents and things.
So say something. You can be transparent
Yes.
about this, right? So I may be crossing the border into to parenthood, right? Not necessarily motherhood, because then, but to parenthood. And then, but there's a reason for that, because it will have an effect on the overall culture. So I think it's
Got it.
really
Okay.
good to have that response.
Yes, for sure. That was a missing piece.
And college is usually 4 years and pregnancy is 9 months. So for most people who are pregnant during college, they're going to be parents too. So like she said, you can justify it both of those ways, I think.
That's so helpful. Thank you.
I'm done.
I don't know what happens next if anyone has any more questions.
I have some things to say. First of all, just well done. So interesting, like fascinating to read, really important. I love how you had just the one interview case study to make it really real. And actually, I think it's a really compelling comparison for you if you want to take this work to the administration at FSU, because I think it raises the question, like, why is FSU so different from UF, right? It's one thing to look at universities nationally and say they vary in these ways, but like we're in the same state. So we have the same sort of political environment, the same sort of culture and like economic constraints and all kinds of things are basically the same between FSU and UF. So it's really interesting to see, you know, the differences there and what we could be doing better. So I guess like one of my questions for you is like, now what? Do you have plans, I guess, to go to graduate school? Do you have a job? Are you working on advocating or getting this in front of any important eyeballs at the university that might be able to make some changes? And is there anything that we as your committee members can do to support you, whether it's writing you letters of recommendation or helping you with your statistical analysis stuff, if that's what you need, or, you know, just moving forward? So that's kind of my big question for you.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I am going to graduate, well, I'm applying to graduate school in the fall. I am pursuing doctoral programs in sociology. So this project right here, all good, accommodating parenthood. Basically, I want to do like stuff like this project and teach is basically like what I want to be my career. So I'm really interested in research, again, specifically like creating tools that help us like quantify like social issues. Feminist theory and family studies is what I'm going to be concentrating on, hopefully. So I am hoping, well, so part of why I did this project was, of course, to get the research experience, but I also wanted to do what Leslie calls, you know, like activist scholarship. So I am hoping to get this in front of people at the administration. They've heard from me a lot. They're tired of it, but it's fine. They're not going to withhold my degree for being annoying. So this is kind of just exactly what I want to do in addition to like teaching, because I love working with people and like public speaking is a thing I love to do. Doing research that specifically supports like tangible like solutions, policy changes and stuff. Some of the other ideas I had for this thesis were a little more like theoretical. Back in January 2020, I gave a presentation about queer families and social change and how we can like theoretically look at parenthood without the lens of gender, but more as like caretakers' independence and like all the politics of that. Would still probably going to write some paper on that someday. It's interesting, but I chose this over that because it would have like a tangible effect. So, you know, my goals are definitely to like send this to the university if there's a listening ear, and it's of course going to be like the writing sample on my graduation school applications. You guys will definitely be the people I'll be reaching out for rec letters in the fall. So I appreciate that.
And definitely to kind of help you figure out where to apply, what programs, and give you all the tips. Yeah, because my PhD is in sociology too, so I can definitely tell you what I know about that. And then just like one more practical question: did you do any on your like comparisons between like religious and secular or private and public? Did you do any like statistical tests, like t-tests, to see if the means were significantly different or not yet?
No, that's where I got a little bit tripped up. I remember I was sitting with Hannah because we both been through like research methods classes, and I was like, how do I'm like, there's a way that we find out if something is statistically significant, and I do not remember how.
All right, we can help with that.
Awesome.
Is your data right now in just like an Excel file, I guess?
Yeah, I was going to use like RStudio for some things, but first of all, I had trouble accessing the program, and second of all, I was like, I think I'm just for my purposes right now, I'm making it harder on myself than it
Yeah.
needs to be. Because I definitely know like the basics of like R code, but not a strength yet. So
You can even do a correlation, a basic correlation or t-test, I think in Excel, right?
You
It's not
can.
that difficult, and there's tons of YouTube videos to explain that.
Okay.
I
So-
would try it in Excel first, and then if you need more help, I can help you, and we can do it in Stata, which is easier and the university has access to, or something like that, instead of R. R's, you know,
ambitious.
R is mean.
not user friendly. Great, awesome. Well, really good job, Emily. I'm excited for you.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Richardson, do you know what happens next?
I think that I need to make a breakout room and we will go and confer, right?
You can put her in the waiting room, so you don't have to put, you just send her to a waiting room. If you,
I don't know how to do that. Let's see if I can figure it out.
so next to participant, next to her name. I just did that a week ago. I did 2 defenses, so.
It says ask to unmute, stop video, chat, pin video, spotlight video, make host, assign to closed caption. But it
So
doesn't.
you don't, so in your settings, you don't have a waiting room, that's why. So breakout room will be your way to go, yes.
Okay.
Oh wait, I think I was able to enable it actually because I have co-host.
Okay. I'll just create a breakout room and oops, that is not what I meant to do. I will send you here, and Emily, I will send you not. Actually, Emily, you don't need to do anything, but hopefully the rest of us will go to breakout room 1 and we will talk. Did that work? Come on. Aye, aye. Delete room. All right. See, I thought I knew what I was doing, but I was wrong. Oh, wait a minute. No. Yeah, I could send you to a waiting room. I have to make you not the co-host anymore.
Oh, that's why. Makes sense now.
Okay.
Do I need to press anything? How do I renounce my, okay, there we go. Oh wait, nope, that wasn't it.
No, so I don't know how to make you not co-host anymore. I can make you.
Would you like?
To participants, you should be able to, oh, yeah, no, I don't see it because I'm not a host.
Zoom.
She can leave the Zoom and
Raw
come.
co-host permission. Okay.